And this is going to be a fluid conversation amongst the panel. We do encourage everybody attending to use the chat bar to put forward your ideas. If you have extra insights or resources, please do copy paste the links into the chat bar so everybody can also have a look at those. If you have specific questions for the panel, you can put them into the Q&A box down below. I'll be filtering in questions from the audience as we go along, but we will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end. So to kick things off for the panel, we now have the announcement finally after a number of years of campaigning for Canada to establish not just a registry, but a publicly accessible registry. It's not here yet, but we have the proposal. Good news. Let's hear from the panel. Your thoughts. Sasha, why don't you kick it off as the campaign manager who was putting this forward? What are your thoughts now that we have the pledge?
Oh, thanks so much, James, for hosting and for organizing this this webinar. The announcement following Budget 2021 was very much welcomed, not only by civil society, but by the international community of transparency advocates, think tanks, journalists, labor as well, and in addition, anti-money laundering experts. This is something that Canada was considering for the past, I would say, since the initial agreement with provinces and territories to strengthen beneficial ownership information. We know that the government of Canada was working on a sort of a two-phase plan, and the sort of initial steps was requiring all private corporations to hold beneficial ownership information internally at the firm level. And then the next step was a consideration of registry options. And I think the landscape for public registries have changed quite dramatically from when I started working on this file back in 2017 to today. We've seen about 40 jurisdictions globally make commitments or have already implemented public registries. 100 jurisdictions have already implemented or are working on a centralized registry, and this is a very different landscape than where things were in sort of 2016 with the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers release, and in 2017 when Canada's previous finance minister, Bill Morneau, worked with provinces and territories on this initial agreement. So, fast forwarding to today, this is a huge step for Canada. It's a big step in the fight against corruption, tax evasion, and in terrorist financing. And it's something that, we are excited to work on as civil society to make Canada's registry the best in class. And I think what you're going to hear today, you're going to hear ideas from myself and others talking about sort of the necessary components to make Canada's registry effective. And that's something that I'm happy to dive into as we continue the webinar.
James? I take it, James, you're having problems with your mic? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, I'll go next. So like Sasha, I was excited about our finance minister, Chrystia Freeland's announcement that we are going to have not just a beneficial ownership registry, but a publicly accessible one. I believe that a properly constructed public registry of beneficial ownership is a much bigger game changer in combating money laundering than's commonly understood. I think by building such a registry, we increase our ability to achieve at least 5 significant goals. We significantly increase our ability to catch tax evaders, money launderers, and the perpetrators of the underlying predicate crimes. And that's saying a lot. Right now, we fail to catch money launderers 99% of the time. I've written about it, others have spoken about it. A public registry of beneficial ownership will significantly improve our ability to catch the bad guys provided the registry is properly constructed. By doing so, by increasing our ability to catch the bad guys, we'll achieve our second goal, and that's to significantly deter criminals from laundering their dirty money in Canada. If launderers think that the chance of getting caught are higher in Canada than elsewhere, they're going elsewhere. Our third goal that we can achieve with a properly constructed registry is we can better protect Canadian businesses from the invisible wrath of money launderers who hollow out our local economies. We have a huge number of shell companies anonymously buying Canadian real estate and leaving those houses and condos vacant. That not only drives up the cost of buying and renting a house, it reduces the number of persons that are living in those homes. And therefore, there's no one there to be going to restaurants, hair salons, movie theaters, dentists. The list of small businesses that are adversely affected by money laundering is significant and widespread in this country. Our public registry, properly constructed, can reverse that. And a fourth goal to achieve with a properly constructed registry is that we provide better protection for honest Canadian businesses that are harmed by criminal competitors who use trade-based money laundering and other forms of illegal pricing and value transfer. It's time to start re-leveling the playing field. A properly constructed public registry helps us do that. We need to protect these business people, many of whom don't even know they're getting hammered by the invisible hand of international money laundering pouring into Canada. And the fifth goal, and perhaps the most surprising people concerned about the cost of a public registry, is that I believe we will create a revenue source for the federal, provincial, and territorial governments of Canada. That's correct. If you build the registry properly, which we'll be discussing in detail today, by creating a circle of information flow, which we'll definitely be talking more about as we go on today, that registry will be a significant moneymaker for the government. And I'm not just talking about recovering, that huge amounts of lost tax revenue from the tax gap. I'm also talking about money launderers themselves. That's because the more money launderers you catch, the more of their assets you seize. And many of those assets held by money launderers in Canada are houses and other immovable properties that can't flee the country, even if the criminals and their enablers are able to do so themselves. We're in a unique position in the fight against money laundering today, and a public registry, one that is properly constructed, can help us make that huge leap towards gaining these significant goals. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Kevin. It was actually my mouse that decided to get stuck on me. Jack, you're joining us from overseas. We've had a conversation here. Open ownership has been, as Sasha said, we're about over 40 or 50 countries that have made pledges to implement a registry. Open ownership has been key to it. From your international perspective, Canada finally coming in on making the pledge for a public registry, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, James. So I'd echo what the other speakers have said on what a welcome and significant move this is from the Canadian government. And as you outlined so well, beneficial ownership transparency has been steadily moving up the policy agenda for the past few years, not least due to the efforts of organizations like TI Canada. So open ownership tracks the number of countries that have made a commitment to beneficial ownership transparency. The policy environment moves pretty fast, but at the moment we think there's over 100 countries have made some kind of commitment to beneficial ownership transparency. That's a big number, but I think until fairly recently, there was a systemic criticism that you could make of beneficial ownership transparency, which was, how does it work if the large economies don't cooperate? And I think from an international perspective, the last few years have been really significant. So first, the EU committing as a bloc via AMLD5 a couple of years ago. And this year has felt like a real watershed moment. So we have the US committing to a central register, albeit not public. And we've got this announcement from Canada on a public beneficial ownership register. So we really have the momentum on commitment now, and we're entering a very different stage, I think, that of implementation. And building a register in the era of implementation, I think is going to be very different from building a register in the past few years, which has been an era of exploration. And I'd say two things about that. So first, beneficial ownership transparency is a new policy area. So we've gone through a period of really rapid learning about best practices as new registers have come online. And I think what's exciting about the Canadian announcement is that globally, this is going to be a very important register for all the reasons that have been mentioned. But it's going to be a second generation register, which means that Canada gets to learn from all of the mistakes and course corrections that the first generation of registers went through and jump straight to best practice. And second, unlike the very early adopters, Canada is not going to be building a register in a vacuum. So other beneficial ownership registers are already up and running. And that matters because we know that companies are global. So we also know that data about company ownership is more useful when it can be joined together from multiple sources. And that requires some level of cooperation and standardization, as I think we'll discuss later. As a federated country, Canada has a real incentive to solve those problems at a national level. And in doing so, I think has the chance to become a real leader at an international level on that particular problem. So yeah, I'm very excited about the Canadian announcement and look forward to discussing it in more detail.
Great, thanks, Jack. So a lot of optimism from the panel to start off with on Canada making up for lost time. On the registry, we, by accident, maybe even come in at a good time that we can learn from others. As Kevin consistently pointed out, properly constructed is a key term here. There's the danger that Canada just pledges to have a registry, but then has a very watered down or unuseful version of the registry. So we're going to talk about what makes a properly constructed registry. So let's start off with just the technical component. There's a lot to a registry. It's not just a matter of the fields, but those are important. Sasha, maybe if you want to walk us through what are some of the key technical components you think Canada needs to have in a properly constructed registry.
Sure, thanks so much, James. So let's start with some of the components which Jack alluded to, and I think is on everyone's mind just after this announcement, and that's the federal provincial harmonization. So Canada is a federated jurisdiction. There's 14 different jurisdictions, and corporations are registered at the provincial level. What ideally should happen is there needs to be a centralized portal amongst all the provinces and territories and the federal government, in which anyone with due diligence requirements, competent authorities and law enforcement, along with sort of foreign jurisdictions, sort of foreign tax authorities, advocates, journalists can all access and be able to look at beneficial ownership information. And this information is readily available and searchable in the same manner as the UK registry and the way in which public registries are evolving. So there's that is sort of the key component, and I'm happy to go into a few examples about how this can work. The next important thing is ensuring that the information that is going to these registers is useful, and there needs to be a data verification component. So this means that that information which entities are submitting needs to be verified. There needs to be a registrar with a team of staff that has specific training in handling sensitive information. And then eventually Canada can explore looking at digital identification, authentication technologies. So for instance, there is one group in Canada called the Digital ID Authentication Council of Canada that is looking at creating a pan-Canadian trust framework, which is really just a pan-Canadian framework to manage IDs and to digitally verify this information. We've seen some digital ID technology already being rolled out with the Canada Revenue Agency, and that which is in partnership with Canada's major banks. This is something that down the road could be useful for a publicly accessible registry, because when you have verified data, it's useful for law enforcement to carry out investigations. And it is incredibly useful for all the reporting entities that have due diligence and know your client requirements. The next thing is there needs to be a wide scheme of penalties to incentivize compliance and to penalize offenders and to deter those who seek to abuse the system. This can range anywhere from administrative monetary penalties all the way up to criminal offenses. And I know this is something that Kevin has written extensively about, and I'm sure he'll be able to provide more comments about this. So to sum up, there's the harmonization, there is the need to verify this information, and then there's the need for register powers and sanctions. The final component, which I think can be unique for Canada and which Canada can offer, is a tip line. The Canada Revenue Agency already has a tip line which anyone can access and to provide information or insight into possible tax evasion. Canada can have the same mechanism where any member of the public can submit a tip and it could be considered by the registrar team. That being said, Canada should also look into developing protection mechanisms so that folks who are at a risk of targeting and harassment can choose to withhold their beneficial ownership information. And this is because, we recognize that this is sensitive information and we value privacy. Privacy is important. And what we really want to root out with this registry is to eliminate the secrecy and the abuse that is associated with anonymous companies while protecting privacy.
Great, thanks, Sasha. So you've hit a couple of top theme issues on accessibility of data, harmonization, verification, the penalty system, tip line protection, and we're going to be doing a deep dive into most of these topics. Kevin, any additional kind of top level components you would recommend that Canada keep in mind?
Yeah, thanks, James. I mean, I completely agree with Sasha that the most important part of a properly constructed registry is verification of the identity information that's provided. Without verification, you've got garbage in, garbage out. You can even get to the extent of arguing that money launderers can just simply make up a name. So you need to have verification of identity. Once you have that, everything changes. So if you've got independent verification by government officials, now you know that the person exists and they are who they say they are. And then that changes everything. That creates the circular flow of information that is key to catching the money launderers. So the beneficial ownership information comes into the registry. That the identity information is then independently verified by the government officials. We know the person exists and he is who he says he is. Then it's separated so that the most confidential information, like the passport itself, that is kept private. That is not put on the registry because of privacy concerns. We just take only the information that is needed to maximize the ability of searchers from around the world to identify false registrants. And I want to make that clear. At every step when we build this registry, we always have to ask ourselves, what is needed to maximize the ability of searchers from around the world to identify false registrants? Because they are the key to the circular flow of information. So after we've separated the highly confidential stuff, we then put on the registry those things that are key to help searchers identify false registrants, and then use their local knowledge to connect them to the underlying predicate crimes and the criminals who perpetrate those. So that means that, someone way off, whether it's in China, in Iran, Russia, whatnot, and they can say, whoa, that 19-year-old kid that's registered as the owner of this company that owns a house in Canada, he's the nephew of the mayor of our major city. That is what you can do with public registry, provided you have that circle of information. And then, as Sasha mentioned, we believe that the registry must have a confidential tip line so that those persons from around the world can communicate that key information to Canadian law enforcement officials. So later on, we're going to talk about what exactly they need in order to maximize their ability. But I will tell you a couple things that we have identified here in Canada that are so significant. And one of them is the problem of transliteration. So often persons from around the world are buying companies, shell companies, and buying property in Canada or using them for trade-based money laundering in Canada. And those persons would avoid detection unless we put in a requirement that their names be disclosed on the registry in their original alphabetic script. For example, if the money launderer comes from Russia or China or whatnot, when they change their name to file on our registry, which will be in English, you take a name like Kevin Como, if you're to change it into Chinese, you can take Kevin and you could have it spelled Caphan. You could come up with 25 different ways so that no one in their home country would be able to identify that person. But by simply adding their name in the original script and putting that also as one of the databases on the registry, we revolutionize the ability of people from all around the world to identify those persons who are falsely registered on the registry. We'll talk more about that later.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So a bit of a teaser on the verification aspect, but definitely why it's important. I'm seeing some questions start to come in on the chat. A reminder, if you want a question to be asked to the panel, if you could put it into the Q&A box. The chat does tend to kind of move fast and it's tough to keep track of all the questions, but great to see a lively conversation happening in the side. Jack, from your point of view, as you said, Canada, second generation beneficial ownership registry, what do we learn from the first registry that you think maybe we haven't identified yet that should be a technical component of a registry?
Yeah, thanks, James. I think Sasha and Kevin gave a really great overview of what the register needs overall. So open ownership has a series of principles, which I'll pop a link to in the chat in a second, but I think it might be useful to just run through a few of the most important ones of those and how they might apply to Canada. So the first principle that I think is really useful for Canada is the idea of comprehensive coverage. So making sure that all of the relevant legal entities and natural persons are eligible for the register. So Kevin had a really great point in his opening discussion around a beneficial ownership register will deter criminals from coming to Canada. And I think that works, but only if there is comprehensive coverage of legal entities. What you don't want to happen is for there to be a flow into opaque vehicles within a jurisdiction. And that I think is something we've seen, for example, in the UK, where there was an uptick in registrations of legal entities that were not eligible to disclose their beneficial owners, and then a downtick when they were eligible to disclose their beneficial owners. So comprehensive coverage of legal entities is a really important principle to bear in mind when it comes to the detail of writing the regulation for a register. The second principle that I think is useful to bear in mind is sufficient detail. So that's just about having the right amount of detail in the information collected from legal entities and natural persons. So just think about what it is you're trying to do with the data. You want to be able to properly identify who it is that you're talking about. You want to be able to identify the nature of control over those legal entities. And you want to be able to understand when and why information is missing because of an exemption or another reason. The third principle that I think is useful to bear in mind is that verification point. I would just emphasize that the quality and confidence in data, it just goes up another level once it's verified. And we're seeing with registers that didn't go for verification the first time around are now moving towards verification because the standard of data just is that much higher if you put verification processes in place. The fourth principle that I think is useful to think about is structured data. So we know that information is that much more useful if it can be processed both by humans and by machines, and the scale of this data means that bad actors are going to hide in multiple ways, and being able to throw both computer brains and human brains at this data is going to make structured data, I think, a necessity for this. So thinking about structuring this in data standards and making it available in multiple formats. So being able to do a kind of cross-economy analysis of all this data is incredibly useful.
Great, thank you, Jack. So all three of you touching on the issue of verification as the cornerstone for this register to even work. As Kevin said, the famous line, garbage in, garbage out. We'll have one, and of course, industry has said, if we're going to have this registry, we need to know that we can actually use it, or else we just won't even rely on it. So how do we get through this crux of making the registry work? I heard a number of different details, technical initiatives that are beyond my own knowledge, but I'm happy to repeat. And I see some of our attendees, including Jean Demira over at AML Shop, is chomping at the bit to talk about this in the chat discussion. But Sasha, do you want to kind of run us through what are some verification options? You mentioned things about digital IDs and whatnot.
Yeah, for sure. I'm thinking it could make sense to talk a little bit about the digital IDs, and then if I'm allowed, I would love to share my screen and show sort of just two architectural models that we're not that we're considering, but that we've outlined, which could be a possible schematic for a harmonized federal provincial.
Yeah, sure. You have share screen ability, so go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see. Oh, perfect. Okay. So let me do this here. Okay. So I think I'm sharing my screen now.
Yes.
And this menu is blocking all the tabs at the top. Hang on. Let me do it this way. Okay, I hope this is clean enough for people. Okay, so maybe let's start a little bit with, so maybe I'll start with the IDs. So one way is to require private corporations to collect identity information of natural beneficial owners and to have them accessible at the company level. And then at the point of incorporation, or when it's updating annual filings, the entity itself can transmit this information about natural beneficial owners to the register in general. And then the register should have some sort of portal where you could submit this identity information digitally. Now, as for the exact technology, we don't know yet, and that's a discussion that is ongoing in Canada. We know that this is happening amongst financial institutions, and it's just a bit too early right now to say like there's a certain mechanism. I know that folks like Jean have done a lot of thinking on this and can provide a lot of context. What I can also suggest right now is two architectural considerations for Canada. So the first is what's called a federated distributed architecture. And that's where provinces and territories independently collect beneficial ownership data from businesses. And then through an API, this data is provided into a central repository. And then there's a tiered system which data can be available to law enforcement and competent authorities, along with entities that do have, or reporting entities that have beneficial ownership reporting requirements, and then a separate tier for civil society and the public. So this is one way. This is one way to consider a sort of a federated, distributed registry in Canada. The second way is through a centralized, what's called a centralized architecture, and that's where all the provinces and territories can submit and access beneficial ownership data through a cloud-based central registry. And then there's, again, sort of a tiering in which data is available to the public and select government agencies. At the moment, there are trade-offs between the two, and it is suggested by from some experts that the API model is perhaps a little bit less secure than the cloud-based model. However, with the cloud-based model, it's because it's quite novel and it's something that a lot of large multinationals use. It's not necessarily a system that the government of Canada has a lot of experience with, or that provincial registries have experience with. But these are sort of two ways in which information can be transmitted from the entity level into a registry. And I'm happy to pass it back to the panel for further remarks, and also stop sharing my screen as well.
Oh, we can't hear you, James.
The famous phrase of the lockdown. Thank you, Sasha, for sharing that. Maybe if you want to put the link into the chat, that's from our coalition's report on how to technically implement a registry. Thank you to Rob Davidson for authoring that. And as you gave a bit of a preview into the harmonization aspect of a registry in a country like Canada, but you also covered the technical components of digital ID. Kevin, you alluded to issues of having the passport, or people being able to give tips about the pieces of ID that are up on the registry. Do you want to elaborate on these in talking about verification?
So when we're discussing verification of particularly of identity verification, what we're really trying to do is increase the integrity of the information. And so I would say that there are actually several steps to it, even before we get to the verification of passports or whatever before that, because there's some things unique about a registry that make it very different than the verification methods that are being used today by reporting entities around the world. Reporting entities around the world are themselves able to see the passport. It's right in front of them. The customer is right there in front of them. They see the utility bill showing that they live at this residence. A registry won't be able to do that, right? We're going to have beneficial owners coming in from around the world. We can't have people sit down and see those in Canada. And so I believe that there are several steps to this information integrity, the identity information integrity that we can take that envelope the verification system itself. So let me just briefly go through those. Right now, we have a bunch of reporting of beneficial ownership to the reporting entities themselves. So when a bank opens up a new account for a customer, they have questionnaires and they ask them for things, who's the beneficial owner and what's your source of funds. But what we don't have is a universal declaration system. The states use it for many things. I'm not saying they use it for beneficial ownership. I'm saying they use it for like patents. When you file a patent, you just sign a form and I hereby declare under threat of perjury that what I'm saying is true. You don't have to have it sworn in front of a notary or commissioned by a commissioner of oath. It's so much easier. It's just on the form, you add one line. And by doing that and by attaching sanctions to those, meaningful sanctions, like for the patent ones in the US, it is large fines and up to 5 years in prison for intentionally false declarations. And we'll talk about sanctions later. But that now gives great integrity to the declaration that that person is making to the bank. So that's for the reporting entity. And I think they need that. And we can just pass legislation that puts in this declaration system. Now, if we have that declaration system along with the registry, it adds integrity to the registry as well. Because companies don't just say, oh yeah, the beneficial owners are X. The companies go out to their shareholders, their registry shareholders, and say, tell me who your beneficial owners are. We need to get that by way of a simple declaration, simple form that, you know, of my shares, the beneficial owners are these persons, and I declare that, you know, under threat of perjury. That gives more integrity to that beneficial ownership information. Then the company itself has an individual who takes all of that and then files it on the registry. And so they would sign one that's saying, you know, to the best of my ability or best of my knowledge, because they don't know actual knowledge, but best of my knowledge, I declare that this is what it is. And that gives great integrity to that information. Then you get the verification on the registry itself. Now, that won't include live passports, but what it can include are certified copies of passports. Simply have someone certify those. And it should be someone who is independent. If you've got a passport or something like that, you can have a lawyer, you can have a notary or whatnot. Now you're starting to get into really high levels of verification. And if you have that to begin with, that comes to the government officials for them to start, they've already got that level of verification. Then you put in those procedures that are used by reporting entities in those not rare, but not common situations where they have a customer that's overseas in some place where, you know, they don't have the registered entity doesn't have offices, so they'll get them notarized by a lawyer. That type of system we bring in. So with that level of verification, I think we greatly improve the integrity of the data going into this registry. And perhaps more importantly, we protect the banks and the reporting entities, the investment banks, and now it's being spread, as you know, to, you know, all through the system. We're going to have requirements that reporting entities collect beneficial ownership. And so now they get the protection that their customers, their clients are not going to be giving them false information, because they will be subject to fines and possibly prison sentences if they give false information. That reduces the exposure, particularly reputational harm, to these institutions and reporting entities.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Jack, back to you for the international perspective. Registry 2.0, I'm liking this term that Canada is on the wave of registries 2.0. What have you got for us on what Canada can learn on verification from our peers?
Yeah, so I think I fully agree with what Kevin is saying on the importance of verification and the means to achieve it. I think it's worth looking at the high level goal of what you're trying to achieve with verification. I think one of the goals is to think about bad actors can hide in bad data. So what you're trying to achieve as a systems designer is to make it as easy as possible to enter good data and as hard as possible to enter bad data. And there's several levels to that. So the first part of verification is just simply validation. So making it easy for people to put in the correct values rather than garbage values for simple data. So one of the earliest mistakes that we saw in the first generation of registers was not validating simple data fields like a country name, for example. So one of the easiest design decisions you can make when making a register is to have drop-down menus rather than free text fields for fields when you know that you're expecting a value to come from a select group of values. I think the second thing you're trying to do is, if you're trying to uniquely identify people, then you want a way to uniquely identify people. And that sounds that sounds quite obvious, but it's one of the hardest things to do as a register. So if that's what you are trying to do, then you are going to have to expend quite a lot of political coordinating effort in order to do that. And that means linking up to probably digital identities, working out how the register is going to assign internal identifiers to people, working out how you're going to deduplicate people when people register twice, and all of that sort of thing. And it is very complicated, but it is one of the most important things that you can do in order to get high quality data, where you can say this person not only owns one company, they own 10 companies in the register. And I think there are multiple ways to do that, some of which we cover in a blog on data verification, which I'll pop into the chat in a second. And I think some of the ways that Kevin was talking about on validation are really good. So one is to have somebody vouch for the data that they're uploading at the level of the company. Slovakia have got a very interesting model where the burden of proof is put onto the company or the beneficial owner. So somebody can just challenge it, and then they have to come along and say, no, this really is the case. And I think that's a really interesting model to potentially look at. And I think the other thing to potentially look at is, like, what do you do with the data once it's on the register? Like, what are the potentials for thinking about how do we detect anomalies? And then what do we do when we detect those anomalies? Because I think at the moment, what we're seeing is there's an awful lot of data on beneficial ownership registers, but not very much coordination with the kind of agencies who could do stuff to think about, here's some potential wrongdoing. We need to kind of organize and think about what to do with it.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good segue, that once we have the information verified, or at least we've got the information entered, we have hopefully most of it verified as factual. Kevin's given examples of if it is not factual, but even if we find that the data leads to a case of money laundering, now what? What should the registry do, and how can it do it? Kevin, I know you've written about this, you've spoken quite passionately about it. I'm going to give the floor back over to you to, you've already talked about some of the sanctions methods. Do you want to expand on your thinking about sanctions and enforcement?
Yeah, gladly. So to my mind, one of the key parts of making the registry effective in combating money laundering is to put in sanctions that include prison sentences. And the reason for that is, well, there's several reasons for that. I mean, one, it's just a recognition of the scourge of money laundering, and that money laundering is just an extension of its underlying predicate crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking, political corruption, that are destabilizing countries and coming into Canada and, you know, destabilizing our housing market to the extent that, you know, an entire generation can't afford to buy a house. So those are significant, but it's much more than that. The reason goes back to that information flow that I'm talking about that's going to happen with the registry. And that's because that information flow is, we put the registry information, identity information, verify and put it on the registry. And then we make it accessible to the public. The public uses its local knowledge to be able to spot false registrants and connect them to the underlying perpetrator of the predicate crime. As I said, oh, you know, there's the, you know, the 19-year-old nephew of the mayor of our town. And then with the confidential tip line, they can give that back. Well, what happens then? If they give it back to Canadian law enforcement agencies, what happens then? If there's no prison sentence attached to it, and we've got, you know, right there the false front guy, and they say, oh, it's going to be a fine of, you know, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's just a cost of doing business to the money launderers. And if it's a house that they bought, you know, brought in a shell company and then bought a house or multiple houses. So what? just sell the houses. That guy who's doing the false front, it's nothing to him. He doesn't risk going to prison, and he'll probably be paid by the money launderers anyway, if not by the sale of the house. So what you need are meaningful sanctions that include prison sentences, because then that changes everything. And it changes everything for two reasons. One, because now you can get cooperation agreements, but and so the threat of going to prison will be a very strong incentive for that person to say, you know what, I will tell you who the ultimate perpetrator of the underlying predicate crime is. You don't have to go through 17 different jurisdictions with shell companies and trusts all around the world.
Yeah.
And that leap right to that guy is a game changer. There's one other game changer I want to talk about that's connected with this as well. And that is a number of, well, I believe that if you put in a registry and you put in proper verification and you allow this circle of information flow that comes back and you have meaningful sanctions to it, you've now undermined the foundation upon which international money launderers are built. They're using all of these professional persons, not just in tax havens, but in countries all around the world, lawyers, accountants, trust companies, corporate services companies, and those persons conveniently don't know their clients are criminals. And so they now act as false fronts. They provide, I'm going to be the director of this company. This director is going to go out and buy a house, or he's going to, go do whatever. Once you require the registration of the beneficial owner and you put in proper verification, now that lawyer or accountant or whatnot out in some tax haven, he may not know his clients are criminals, but he knows he's not the beneficial owner of that company or of the large mansion that he owns in West Vancouver. That means those people are effectively significantly reduced in their ability to help money launderers. And what does that mean? That means money launderers have to then resort to persons who they very much trust. That means people like relatives, close friends, or trusted business associates. And that's horrible news for money launderers, because those persons are much more easily identified as being connected to them. And that's why it's important to have this circle of information on the public registry and to have meaningful sanctions. Because when you have that nephew who just is registered there and you catch him, you say, hey, he's connected to that. Then you put in those sanctions. Now he doesn't want to go to prison.
Yeah.
And that can bring you all the way back to the corrupt mayor or to the guy who's doing human trafficking, drug trafficking. It revolutionizes the way we fight money laundering as well as the underlying predicate crimes.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. That's a very interesting example of how the registry can be used to deter and both fight crime. Sasha, to do this, for the registrar to investigate and to follow up, what kind of components internally do you think are needed? Kevin's talking about greater sanctions. Do you have any thoughts on sanctions or want to expand on the tip line or the kind of staffing that the registrar would need?
I think Kevin hit all the points quite brilliantly. I would say, like, in addition to the scope of sanctions, the registrar can also provide reminders and notices to corporations regarding compliance. And so this registrar, this registrar is not out to get private corporations if if there's a spelling error or any administrative error. That's where reminders come into play. A good example is Canada's lobby registry. You can contact the lobby registry, ask questions, and get advice and insight about how to be compliant and what are the deadlines and what information do you need to collect internally at the firm level in order to be compliant. So the goal of the registry is to promote compliance and to penalize offenders with a wide variety of tools. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I mean, there's like we talked a bit about the tip line as well. You know, I forgot to mention, like, the UK does have a tip line option, but you know, Canada can look towards the CRA and to understand how their tip line works and emulate it for this registry.
Great.
Maybe
yep,
one quick, sorry. Oh,
yep.
one quick thing on deterrence. Public registries work, and they are changing the political economy of dirty money that is being transmitted globally. So, for instance, with the UK, you know, when Global Witness and an open data group looked at different types of incorporations, they noted that as soon as the UK register was public, Scottish limited partnerships, which is an entity that is notoriously abused by transnational crime organizations and particularly in Eastern Europe, rates of incorporations dropped by about 80%. And there is also evidence of different civil society organizations using BO registers to flag instances of corruption or misconduct by politically exposed persons. So the registers globally are already being in use and are having an impact on dirty money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I understand that there's new data coming out as well. I think on Latvia or Estonia, it might be Latvia's registry that's showing the same results as the Scottish registry, or the UK registry on SLP. So looking forward to that data. Jack, once again, internationally, what are other registrars doing for enforcement and sanctions? Do you see any effective tools that Canada should think about using?
Yeah, I think Kevin actually covered most of what I would recommend. I think there's three high-level principles that are worth thinking about. So one is that meaningful sanctions must be matched with enforcement, and I think that's where we're seeing the least amount of progress, to be honest. And I think that requires real kind of political leadership. It requires resourcing the relevant authorities properly. And I think it also probably requires kind of culture change in a lot of the associated sectors, where you require a little bit of cooperation to kind of discover who are the bad actors in the relevant sectors. And I think that's where I would go to the second principle, which I think Kevin touched on, which is sanctions must attach to all of the relevant parties. So that means all of the relevant people attached to the reporting entity, but also all of the people kind of in the value chain attached to the company. So accountants, lawyers, etc. And I think making that change is going to be a really important part of making beneficial ownership registers not just part of the kind of information infrastructure, but part of having effective outcomes in reducing the misuse of legal entities for AML. And then I think the other point is that the authority that is in charge of the register must have some kind of authority to act when it knows that there is bad information in the register. The problem with the UK's register, for example, is that right now it has a legal duty to just accept whatever is put into the register, and that means that the register has a lot of really quite bad information in it, and there isn't that information flow that Kevin mentioned, and that I think is really the starting point, that the relevant authorities need the right legal tools and authority to act.
Great. Before moving on to the next planned question, I'm going to bring one in from the audience that was triggered from a comment that you made, Jack, about where the UK registry is housed. We have one question here from Stephen Scott. What agency might domicile the registry? Who will verify or investigate the records? So we've been talking about the registry a little bit in the abstract of this entity. Sasha, you alluded a little bit to the structure of how it would work with other entities, but where do we think it's actually going to be? There's a couple of options, and not to put you on the spot, Jack, but if you want to elaborate on maybe the UK and if you've seen different models, or is it consistent where a registry is housed in different countries?
So the UK registry is run by a trading company owned by the UK government. The government department responsible is the business environment. I've kind of probably got the acronym wrong there, but certainly the business department. What we see kind of internationally is that sometimes it's the finance department, sometimes it's the business department. Other times the FIU can be interested in running the department. And I think it really kind of depends on who has the funds, who has the interest, where the current company register lies. And I think for me, probably the most important part is that the beneficial ownership information doesn't end up living separately from existing company information, if that makes sense for the situation. And I think in Canada, that may not be the case, but because of if there's going to be a proposed federated system. So that isn't a very clear answer, because there is no single best place for a beneficial ownership register to live institutionally, because it is very much dependent on local context.
Right, and I think that goes into the actual plan question of the harmonization. Jack, as you might hear from Canadians every now and again, our stereotypical favorite sport is hockey, but in actual fact, it's federal politics, the fight between the feds and the provinces and the territories over jurisdiction. And this topic of beneficial ownership transparency is certainly latest round in the sport. Sasha, you showed us a diagram of how the information might flow, combining this question of where the registry would be domiciled and the 14 jurisdictions, as you discussed. How are we going to deal with harmonization in Canada, and where will the registry fit amongst the 14 jurisdictions?
No, thanks for that question. And so this is part of this is going to be the formative part of this conversation on the registry design. So right now, inside with Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, there is a separate branch that is part of the ministry called Corporations Canada, and that's where one can look up all federally incorporated entities. There's information about the current requirements for individuals of significant control. This was part of Canada's first step on beneficial ownership requirements. So the registry likely is going to live with Corporations Canada, and we know this because in the federal budget announcement, Minister Freeland announced $2.1 million to Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada towards the creation and the establishment of a registry. So that's likely the place. There does need to be there definitely needs to be staffing with specific training to handle this kind of sensitive information. I think everyone touched on this before. Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada has also been leading conversations with provinces about registry options for the past 3 or 4 years. So this is something that provinces are accustomed to, as formidable as sort of federal, provincial, territorial politics might be. For something like this, I think we are going to see a harmonized registry, and there are many policy areas in which provinces and the federal government cooperate with easily for, and this could be one of them because of the nature of the issue. It's something that all G7 countries are working on. It is an initiative that all G20 countries are working on. It has national security implications, and it also has implications for the private sector with respect to fraud and supplier due diligence. So I think naturally we're going to see provinces want the federal government to take the lead on this, and housing it with the department with the right experience. It looks like right now that it's going to be Corporations Canada. We also know that Finance Canada is involved as a partner on this, and they're going to be offering a lot of experience from their financial crimes team, and specifically with that experience in handling sensitive information. So I think that's how we're going to see the evolution, and looking forward to more exploratory conversations.
Yeah, and also, Sasha, as you mentioned, the federal government taking the lead. You also talked about in the beginning the cooperation, the process between the feds and the government, but some of the provinces aren't waiting for the federal government. Do you want to provide a bit of an update on where the movers and shakers are at the provincial level who are taking some bold leaps?
For sure, yeah, absolutely. So, so two provinces come to mind. Quebec was the first to announce its own publicly accessible beneficial ownership registry. Quebec had an advantage because all provincial entities were already searchable on its corporate registry, and this information was available to the public. And so Quebec took the next step in budget 2020 and said, look, we're going to include beneficial ownership information to our existing corporate registry. And right now, a lot of the measures for this initiative is being finalized. It's part of Bill 78, and it was improved in principle adopted in principle in the Quebec legislature. And I believe within the next month or so, it will pass and become something that the Quebec government will start working on. The next province that comes to mind is British Columbia. So BC has been in the news quite a bit with regards to real estate-based money laundering. And the BC government has gone ahead with the Landowner Transparency Registry. So it's a beneficial ownership registry for properties and companies that happen to own property. This registry is live, and it's a very unique registry when you look at other registries around the world, and it's a wonderful first step in getting a registry online for Canada, and then having it being used and recognized by other international jurisdictions. So those are sort of the two front runners, and the federal government is certainly in conversations with both. I know this, and many other experts know this as well. And there's a lot of knowledge that is developing in Canada. It's at the early stages, but it's evolving, and hopefully we do get to that registry 2.0 that's searchable, accessible, and with all the bells and whistles that would make an effective registry.
So within one webinar, we've gone from Canada's snow washing problem to Canada's Register 2.0 advantage. I like it. We're making momentum within one webinar. Jack, just to come back to you, you've heard about harmonization, of course, in our 14 jurisdictions, but there's a harmonization issue globally anyways, because eventually the goal is that all these registries can communicate and share data. I mean, certainly from a business perspective, most businesses would like to have just one standard set of data. And I know open ownership is definitely working towards this goal. Do you want to fill in the audience on the open ownership standard, or the data standards?
Yeah, so open ownership have something called the beneficial ownership data standard, which is a structured way of publishing beneficial ownership information. And we are working with some countries to publish data from registers using that data standards. We also have something called the Open Ownership Register, which has beneficial ownership information taken from 4 or 5 national registers, and also extractives industries transparency initiative countries. And what we hope is that that data standard can be used by countries to publish their data in a way that makes beneficial ownership information interoperable. And what we think is that, like, data standards are kind of like compound interest for doing analysis. So once you've done it once on one country's data, you can reuse that analysis anywhere on data that's published in the same format. It also allows you to put data together from multiple jurisdictions. It allows you to build complex analyses and really kind of like see the value in data on companies that are multinational, complex company structures and all of that sort of thing. And I think just hearing the kind of the challenges that Canada is facing, I think that kind of thinking around data standardization is very relevant, because you've got provinces who are producing data in one way, companies producing data in multiple ways, I expect, and they will all need to be uploading it to one central portal. And I think that to me speaks to the advantages of data standardization, one format, publish once, use multiple times. And I think that kind of thinking would be really good to advance in Canada, because to me, it doesn't make sense for each province to implement in a different way, and then for everybody to be having to analyze in a different way. So yeah, that's kind of what the beneficial ownership data standards is designed to alleviate.
Great. We're coming up to the end. I want to get in one more topic and final thoughts, but before moving, Kevin, any thoughts on harmonization?
Well, within Canada, I would say because of costs, the federal government has to take the lead at a minimum of doing all the verification work of beneficial ownership on the registry. It's just a fact that our smaller provinces and territories could never afford that, and therefore they would be the weak link and therefore the target of more money laundering. So, we have to have it that way. The part of the problem is the provinces want to hold on to their corporate registries because they make money from that. And so you've got those competing interests. And I think what you can do is, if you have a public registry that is federal, central, and you have the other information just being fed into there, I think that makes more sense to me. And particularly at a minimum, the verification has to be done in one spot with the experts, and that spot has to be with the federal government.
Great. There's so much we can still go through with this topic, but we are running out of time. So there's one more question I want to get to, and this is on the nature of corporate control itself. Within the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Act, beneficial ownership is defined as 25% ownership or of significant control for a company. This is a standard used for many countries, but it's also slightly arbitrary, as it was, I believe, a recommendation put out by the FATF and even challenged by a number of companies. And even here in Canada, there are different registries that use a lower standard. Jack, do you have anything to say about the trend globally on the definition of corporate control, of where Canada might, yet again, a Canadianism, skate to where the puck is going, not where it is? You can shake your head at that if you want, that you don't understand this terminology.
No, the terminology makes perfect sense to me. And I think that 25% certainly has become sort of came out of, I think, a slight misunderstanding of what the FATF was suggesting. And never was a real kind of like hard recommendation from them. It was more kind of like an example rather than a firm guideline. Certainly we're now seeing countries move that threshold lower. And I certainly think that, any threshold is going to be gameable by a criminal who is determined enough. The key thing around definitions, I think, is to make sure your definition is comprehensive enough that you capture all forms of control. So you want to make sure that you are very definite that a beneficial owner is a natural person, that you cover all of the forms of control that a natural person can exercise control over a legal entity, and that you have some kind of get out clause around like another catch-all clause of control other than the ones that you specify. And I think if you do that, then and require those forms of control to be specified, then at least you have on paper the things that an investigator can be looking for, and be looking for the traces of that control in other data sources. Because I think the thing to remember about a beneficial ownership register is that it is only one side of the ledger. It is what one person is telling you about their control over a company, and the kind of the evidence for their control is often somewhere else. So that a beneficial ownership register is kind of necessary but not sufficient to working out whether somebody really does control a company.
Mhm. Sasha, we've been having this conversation here in Canada about where this definition could go. Your thoughts on what you would hope to see as the conversation evolves here?
For sure. I think the first challenge is getting the registry set up correctly, and that's going to be where a lot of the energy and the conversations are going to begin. The threshold itself with ownership, I mean, as Jack mentioned, like indirect control is very, very difficult to ascertain. And this is gonna come once Canada is exchanging knowledge and learning with other jurisdictions. If, for instance, like right now, the 25% threshold is convenient simply because it's harmonized with other laws in Canada, other requirements, but it could drop conceivably to 10%. But that's something that at the moment is, like, I would say it's an important goal, but getting the registry set up correctly should be the first and the most pressing need. There are forums that are evolving which Canada can participate in. So for instance, this is a shout out to Open Ownership and the Open Government Partnership. There is a beneficial ownership leadership group that consists of governments that have made commitments to public registries and are working together with Open Ownership in trying to in creating beneficial ownership registries that are best in class and using the best open data principles and mechanisms. And this is a forum I think that Canada can take advantage of and learn with experts in other jurisdictions that are rolling out these registries.
Great. Kevin, any thoughts on the issue of significant control or corporate ownership?
Yeah, sure. So I agree with Jack. First, you have to make sure you and Sasha, you have to have a definition of corporate control that covers very specifically indirect control of a company. That being said, we can get that from other jurisdictions. The question is, what do you use as a catch-all? Do you use 25%? Do you use some other number? In Canada, we already use 10% for in securities law. BC is already using 10%. Part of the reason why we are naturally going towards that target is because 25% is just too easy to get around. You just have 5 people instead of 4, and each one having equal shares, and then you aren't captured by the basket of a percentage of ownership, and therefore you can say, oh well, I'm not a beneficial owner. So it's too easy to get around, and money launderers are always trying to get around the rules. Just make it 10%. That's not particularly onerous. If you own 10% or more of a company, you have to disclose. It's not that big a deal. Remember, we're talking about private companies as well. How often do they change their ownership? They're not publicly listed. They're not publicly traded. So those are not on the registry. It's just private companies, private trusts, and partnerships eventually. And in those cases, they don't change ownership that often. 10% wouldn't be particularly onerous.
Right. So definite emphasis for especially any of our government officials attending in the audience today to cover bases on definitions of ownership and any legal structures. And there is precedence within, thank you for flagging that, Kevin, that there is precedence within Canada for lowering the percentage. Before we get into final thoughts, I'm going to abuse my position as moderator and the ED of TI Canada to promote that we are having this conversation again tomorrow for our Francophone audience, if you, with a whole different panel, I don't think the 4 of our French is good enough to have it, but we have an excellent panel for tomorrow. If you would like to register, there's still space available. It'll be moderated by our chair and president, Susan Cote-Freeman, and an excellent panel there. Additionally, if you want to know more about TI Canada, we're always happy to have more support. You can become a TI Canada member by registering at our website here. If you are interested in your company or organization being a supporter, such as the supporters I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, our Platinum supporters, Export Development Canada and Siemens Energy, our Gold supporters, Banque Nationale, Blake's, Deloitte, Denton, Sky Power Global, and VDOT Group, our Silver supporters, ACFO, Kinross Gold, and Thales, and of course our grant supporter for this project, Open Society Foundation. You can go to TI Canada's website to the supporter page. And if you are not one for paperwork and you just want to give us money right away for continuing to do the great work that we do, you can go ahead and make a donation right here and you will receive your tax receipt for making that donation right away. So that is my shameless plug to ask for the continued support for our organization to keep doing this work. And so we'll wrap this up. Well, thank you again, everybody, for coming today. Let's have final thoughts on the conversation we've had on how Canada can achieve Registry 2.0, shaking off the horrible past of snow washing, moving ahead, and the success of this announcement for the Registry by 2025. Can we even get it sooner? Jack, I'm going to turn it over to you first from the international perspective. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, James. I think what I've heard today is really exciting. I think there's an enormous amount of opportunity in Canada. I think if I was to give Canada one piece of advice, it would be there are an awful lot of constraints put on technical implementation once you get to writing the regulation and the laws. So I think you really need to be very clear about what it is you want to achieve on a technical level when you're writing your regulation and all of that stuff. So that, I think, is what you need to be getting very clear at this stage before you start setting constraints on the people who are going to be doing the work, many of whom will be on this call today, I think.
Great. Kevin, final thoughts, where Canada is based on where we're going to go, Register 2.0, go.
I think the most important thing that we need to do in order to make this a successful registry in combating money laundering is to ask ourselves what is needed to maximize the ability of searchers from around the world to identify false registrants. And we need to ask that question at each stage of information flow. Put on the registry, transferring out to the registry, and allowing people to get that information back to Canadian law enforcement agencies. Each time we must ask ourselves at every stage, what is needed to maximize the ability of searchers from around the world to identify false registrants?
Great. Sasha, final word to you. Working on this campaign for 4 years, the day the budget got announced, you called me up, I called you up, and we were just ecstatic, but there's still work to do. What are your final thoughts in this moment?
No, thanks, James. This has been a long campaign, and I think we just ended the first chapter, and we're gonna be starting sort of the middle on working towards Canada creating an effective registry. I think to echo Kevin's point, a public registry isn't like making this registry public isn't just an abstract virtue, but it is an important tool that shows evidence in deterring the proceeds of crime and enabling everyone around the world to use this tool with very limited barriers. We want to protect privacy, that needs to be built in, but we also want to address secrecy. And I think the next logical step for Canada is to work with provinces and endeavor to announce a public harmonized framework for sharing and disclosing beneficial ownership information as part of ongoing work between the federal government, provinces, and territories. And I also think Canada can certainly take advantage of international experts and international forums to learn best practices and be able to leapfrog, some of those painful moments in Registry 1.0, so we can get to Registry 2.0.
Registry 1.0 and snow washing, a thing of the past. Registry 2.0 and Canada leaping to the front of the classroom after so many years of being piled on by international peers and even domestic organizations like our own. There's still ways to go until the 2025 deadline. With any luck, we will see an earlier delivery of the registry. But there's momentum now for Canada to move forward. We have the UN General Assembly special session on corruption and the G7 this coming week, at the end of this week, and the FATF reviewing recommendations on beneficial ownership transparency. Lots of room for Canada to now stand on, to learn from, in implementing a best-in-class registry. So we hope to keep having this conversation with experts. There's a lot of room still to work on, a lot of discussion still to have, and hopefully we'll engage on this conversation with government and provincial officials. Jack Lord, Kevin Como, Sasha Caldera, thanks for having this conversation with me today. Thank you everybody for attending during your lunch break or your morning or late evening. I saw somebody from Indonesia joining us late at night. Bravo you for staying up so late to hear from this. I hope it was informative. Everybody get vaccinated, wash your hands, keep social distance until we're all safe, and look forward to seeing you all another time. Thank you.
Thank you.